should have left you alone. Now life is beating them one by one. The truth doesn't knock politely on the door of reality. Sometimes it kicks the door entirely off the hinges. It walks directly into the center of the living room and demands that absolutely everyone take off their carefully constructed, suffocating masks. Most people do not actually hate justice, nor do they inherently hate the concept of fairness. What they violently, viscerally despise is the blinding, inescapable light of consequence that justice inevitably brings right to their front porch. They hate what the truth makes them feel about their own manufactured, completely unauthentic lives. Chosen ones, if you are listening to these words, you have likely been sitting in the quiet for a very long time, watching a bizarre, chaotic, and deeply unsettling theatrical performance unfold entirely around you. You have been walking a lonely, agonizing path of profound spiritual awakening. You have been targeted, whispered about, deliberately undermined, and perhaps entirely isolated by individuals who smiled warmly in your face, while simultaneously plotting your downfall behind closed doors. You have been forced to endure the invisible, exhausting warfare of insecure, highly performative people who desperately tried to drag you down into their manufactured chaos. They should have left you alone. It really was that incredibly simple. All they had to do was walk away, focus intensely on their own lives, tend to their own stagnant gardens, and attempt to build something genuine for themselves. But they couldn't do it. Their bloated egos, their deeply hidden insecurities, and their pathological need to feel superior would not allow them to simply let you exist in peace. And now the entire spiritual atmosphere has shifted. Now you are watching from a safe, elevated distance as life systematically dismantles their grand illusions. You are witnessing the universe stepping in to do the heavy lifting on your behalf. They are unraveling, and life is beating them down, one by one, not because you cast a spell or sought petty revenge, but because they built their entire existence on the fragile, crumbling fault lines of their own unhealed toxicity. You represent the terrifying mirror they spent their entire lives running away from. And because they tried to violently shatter you, instead of doing the work to heal themselves, the jagged shards of their malicious intentions are now raining back down upon them. We are going to explore the absolute core of this undeniable dynamic. Let's break down exactly why their lives are unspooling, why their frantic attempts to mimic or destroy you are failing so spectacularly, and why their karma is arriving with zero delays. Let's get into it. Before we dive deep into this unmasking, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, drop a comment with what point hit you hardest, and share the video with someone who needs the reminder. Number 1. They assumed your silence was a symptom of surrender, completely unaware that it was actually the highest form of spiritual discipline. When they launched their covert campaigns, when they started the toxic whispers and the subtle sabotage, they expected you to crumble entirely. They fully expected you to immediately step out of your character, descend into the mud, and actively fight them on their extremely low vibrational level. But you did not. You remained completely anchored. You operate from a place of profound, self-sourced internal alignment. Your peace is not a temporary mood. It is a massive architectural fortress, built brick by heavy brick, in the absolute dark. In stark contrast, they operate entirely on a borrowed, incredibly insecure, and highly performative facade. Their entire sense of self is externally validated, meaning they desperately need a loud reaction from you just to confirm that they exist and have a semblance of power. When you offered them absolutely nothing but silence, You did not just ignore them. You fundamentally starved their demons. The deep psychology driving their erratic behavior is rooted in a terrifying, bottomless fear of their own undeniable stagnation. They are paralyzed by a fragile ego that knows, in the quiet, lonely hours of the night, that it possesses absolutely no intrinsic value. They rely heavily on a toxic script, a highly predictable cycle of provocation and emotional reaction. They actively provoke. You angrily react. They play the innocent victim or the grand victor, and their bloated ego gets fed. It is a completely parasitic ecosystem. But when you flatly refuse to read from their tired script, when you deny them the massive emotional explosion they were heavily banking on, they experience a violent, terrifying loss of control. Their internal world spirals into absolute, unmitigated chaos because their primary coping mechanism has been completely neutralized. They are suddenly, violently forced to sit in the deafening echo chamber of their own malice, with absolutely no one to blame but themselves. The deep silence you provided acted as a massive, inescapable mirror, forcing them to look at the ugly, unhealed reality of their own deeply flawed internal mechanics. To truly understand how deeply tragic and profoundly goofy this looks from the outside, imagine someone frantically stacking wet playing cards on a highly windy table, desperately trying to build a magnificent tower to impress the neighbors. Meanwhile, you are miles away, quietly and methodically stacking heavy, unshakable bricks on solid bedrock. They keep aggressively screaming at the wind, wildly throwing their wet cards in your general direction, angrily demanding that you stop building your brick house because it makes their pathetic card tower look incredibly cheap. It is an exhausting, frantic, entirely pathetic spectacle. They are actively burning massive amounts of caloric and spiritual energy, fighting a totally one-sided war against a person who is not even looking in their direction. Now, life is systematically beating them down because you absolutely cannot sustain a massive war on an empty stomach. Their obsession with breaking your peace has completely bankrupted their own. They see the confidence but not the internal battles. They see the calm but not the resilience, and they are entirely consumed by a battle they engineered, fought, and lost all by themselves, while you simply kept breathing and building. Number 2, they are suffocating under the crushing, unbearable weight of the artificial script they meticulously wrote for themselves. When people decide to actively compete with a chosen one, they rarely, if ever, do it authentically. They fundamentally understand that they cannot beat you based on pure character, deep integrity, or spiritual depth, because they possess absolutely none of those traits. Therefore, they construct an elaborate, highly fictional narrative, a theatrical script in which they explicitly cast themselves as the thriving, successful, flawless protagonist, and they forcefully attempt to cast you as the irrelevant, defeated extra. They meticulously curate their social media presence, they rigorously rehearse their casual conversations, and they heavily edit their public persona to project an absolute image of perfection and untouchable superiority. But you, the chosen one, have never once relied on a script. Your life, with all of its messy, agonizing, painful, and deeply beautiful evolution, is deeply grounded in brutal authenticity. You have earned your alignment through the scorching fires of genuine adversity, while their entire persona is nothing more than a cheap, rented tuxedo. The deep psychology of this toxic imitator is entirely defined by an absolute, paralyzing terror of being exposed as ordinary, highly flawed, or entirely inadequate. Maintaining a massive lie, especially a comprehensive, lifestyle-encompassing lie, requires an immense, staggering amount of daily caloric, emotional, and spiritual energy. Every single morning they wake up, they have to actively remember exactly who they are pretending to be today. They have to constantly monitor the audience to ensure the fragile facade is holding strong. This absolute reliance on a script that you outright refuse to follow is driving them to the absolute brink of spiritual exhaustion. They desperately want to appear divinely blessed to the outside world, but they entirely lack the internal scaffolding required to actually support the heavy weight of real blessings. They are driven entirely by a remarkably fragile ego that falsely equates high visibility with actual human value, and they are utterly terrified of losing control over how they are perceived by the masses. Think of their miserable existence as being akin to acting like someone wearing incredibly expensive, flashy jewelry they went into massive, crippling debt to acquire, just to walk past your house every day and desperately hope you look out the window. Meanwhile, you are quietly and methodically stacking solid bricks on firm ground, completely unbothered by who is watching your construction process. As the unpredictable wind of reality inevitably blows, their delicate card tower collapses repeatedly, requiring them to start over from scratch, increasingly panicked, sweaty, and exhausted. It is a deeply tragic, entirely goofy sight to behold. Life is now beating them down severely because the universe simply does not reward sustained deceit. The massive cognitive dissonance between who they secretly know they are in the dark and who they loudly pretend to be in the light is violently tearing their psyche apart. They are breaking under the immense pressure of their own exhausting performance, entirely unable to ever take off the heavy mask because their actual face has completely withered away beneath it. Number 3. Their frantic, obsessive mimicry has violently mutated into a deeply tragic parody of your authentic blueprint. It is undeniably one of the most unsettling, bizarre experiences a chosen one will ever have to endure. Watching someone who supposedly dislikes you or actively competes with you slowly begin to copy every single thing about you. Suddenly, out of nowhere, they adopt your specific vocabulary, your unique mannerisms, your spiritual interests, your career ambitions, and even your distinct personal style. They literally attempt to download your personality as if it were a simple software update. But what they ultimately possess is a cheap, borrowed, highly plastic replica of your deep essence. Your beautiful traits were painstakingly forged in the intense crucible of profound isolation, agonizing healing, and genuine spiritual awakening. You literally paid for your quiet wisdom with hot tears, severe heartbreak, and profound surrender to the divine. They, on the exact other hand, are desperately trying to steal the shiny aesthetic of your success without undertaking any of the agonizing internal work required to actually sustain it. Why do they behave this way? The psychology of the hater who obsessively mimics you is entirely governed by a profound, echoing emptiness. Their internal landscape is completely hollowed out by festering envy. They look at the warm light you naturally emit, the unshakable peace you hold in chaotic rooms, and the quiet magnetism you possess. And they falsely assume it is a tangible, physical commodity they can simply try on like a new jacket at the mall. Their incredibly fragile ego convinces them that if they just mechanically say the exact things you say, and physically do the exact things you do, they will automatically receive the immense respect, love, and divine favor you receive. But they fail to comprehend the massive spiritual law. The universe responds exclusively to the genuine frequency of the soul, not the clumsy imitation of the flesh. They are terrified of their own absolute lack of originality, and they are losing control because no matter how perfectly they attempt to copy your external moves, the internal results are never, ever the same. This tragic dynamic looks exactly like someone putting on a highly decorated, pristine military uniform, heavily pinning medals to their chest that they casually bought from a Halloween costume shop, and aggressively demanding to be saluted by actual, combat-tested veterans. They have never once seen a battlefield. They have never bled for a cause. They have never faced the paralyzing terror of the dark night. Yet they arrogantly demand the honor and respect reserved strictly for the survivor. It looks profoundly frantic and embarrassingly goofy from the outside. It is the spiritual equivalent of identity theft, and it is an entirely unsustainable way to live. Life is currently dealing them blow after heavy blow, because a cheap copy can never withstand the rigorous stress testing of actual reality. When true adversity inevitably strikes, their stolen, flimsy persona melts away instantly, leaving them completely defenseless, highly panicked, and entirely exposed for the absolute fraud they truly are. Number 4, life is brutally forcing them to actually live inside the miserable, chaotic reality they desperately projected onto you during the absolute height of their malicious campaign against you. They tried with every fiber of their being to convince you, and everyone else in the vicinity, that you were the fundamental problem. They aggressively projected their own profound insecurities, their secret failures, their rotting bitterness, and their undeniable stagnation directly onto your good name. They painted a dark, elaborate picture where you were the villain, the failure, the unstable one who was completely lost in life. But the chosen one possesses an internal architecture built entirely on solid, undeniable truth. You absolutely refused to internalize their toxic venom. You stood firmly in your divine alignment, silently processing the pain, transmuting the heavy betrayal, and continuing to walk your designated path. You flatly refused to become the emotional receptacle for their unhealed, festering garbage. The deep psychology of projection is a well-documented defense mechanism strictly used by the emotionally weak to completely avoid personal accountability. The highly performative imitator behaves this way because actually facing their own toxic, rotting nature would result in a complete and total psychological collapse. It is infinitely easier for their fragile ego to point a trembling finger at a chosen one and loudly declare that they are the broken one than it is to look squarely in the mirror and quietly admit that they are systematically destroying their own life. But here is the exact spiritual law they entirely failed to account for. Whatever dense, malicious energy you intentionally send out into the world, if it is firmly denied entry by the intended target, it absolutely must return to the sender, multiplied. They heavily relied on a toxic script where you failed miserably and they triumphed gloriously. But because you rejected the script, the dark energy boomeranged with terrifying precision. Metaphorically, they spent long, obsessive months, gleefully pouring deadly poison into a cup, sliding it slowly across the table to you, and aggressively demanding that you drink it. When you simply looked at them, stood up, pushed the cup back across the table, and walked completely out of the room. They were left sitting entirely alone with their own poison, and now, out of sheer unadulterated desperation and spiritual thirst, life is physically forcing them to drink their own toxic concoction. They are waking up wondering why their stomach burns, why their personal life is rapidly falling apart, why they are suddenly dealing with the exact financial ruin, social isolation, or emotional turmoil they so fervently prayed would happen to you. It is agonizing to watch, yet perfectly, flawlessly just. They are permanently trapped in the very snare they meticulously, obsessively laid for your feet. They see the calm you hold in the storm, but not the resilience it took to build the shelter. They are actively living out the living nightmare they designed specifically for you, while you build your promised land on solid rock. Number 5. The shallow, stagnant pool of external validation they heavily relied upon to breathe is rapidly and permanently drying up. You, as a chosen individual, have learned the excruciatingly painful but ultimately beautiful art of deep internal anchoring. When absolutely everyone walked away from you, when you were heavily misunderstood, smeared, and casually cast aside by people you loved, you learned how to source your validation directly from the divine. You learned how to find true comfort in your own soul and in your unwavering, uncompromising integrity. You completely no longer need the loud applause of the crowd to know you are walking in the exact right direction. But the highly performative people actively competing with you are fundamentally, biologically different creatures. They are entirely constructed out of external validation. They are purely performative beings who literally only exist in the reflection of other people's eyes. Their entire sense of self-worth is strictly dictated by social media likes, cheap praise, perceived status, and the sycophantic, continuous agreement of their toxic enablers. The harsh, psychological reality of this specific type of hater is securely rooted in a terrifying, bottomless, echoing void within their own core. They behave with such frantic, over-the-top superiority because if they ever stop performing, if the applause stops for even a single, solitary second, they are violently forced to confront the absolute nothingness of their true identity. They manipulate, they scheme, they lie, and they actively spread malicious gossip specifically to rally weak-minded people to their side, creating an artificial, temporary army of supporters to make themselves feel artificially powerful. But life has an incredibly reliable way of eroding artificial loyalty over time. The captive audience they fought so dirty and so hard to capture is slowly, finally waking up. People are beginning to clearly see the massive cracks in their carefully painted mask, the glaring inconsistency of their stories, the deeply exhausting nature of their constant drama, and the sheer suffocating toxicity of their presence are driving their once loyal followers far away. This dynamic is the exact equivalent of a deeply insecure, untalented actor standing alone on a grand, massive stage, aggressively screaming their dramatic lines into a completely empty auditorium because the entire audience quietly got up and walked out halfway through the very first act. They are acting exactly like a highly leaky bucket, furiously begging the sky for rain, completely unable to understand that no matter how much water is poured into them, they will always, inevitably, end up entirely empty. Life is beating them down with heavy blows because the one singular thing they absolutely need to survive, the constant, unwavering attention of others, is being systematically and permanently removed from their desperate grasp. They are helplessly watching their social currency plummet entirely to zero. And as the absolute silence around them grows louder and louder, their internal panic reaches a fever pitch. They never learned how to sit in an empty room and be okay with themselves, and now they are forced to completely unravel within one. Number 6. They entirely underestimated the sheer, crushing spiritual exhaustion of fighting a relentless battle you completely refused to participate in. When they aggressively launched their covert, obsessive war against you, they fully expected a spectacular, highly public clash. They expected you to fiercely defend yourself, to argue loudly, to stoop down to their low level, to sling mud, and to engage in a bitter, never-ending back-and-forth screaming match. That chaotic, muddy arena is the exact environment they know best. That is exactly where they thrive and extract their dark energy. But as a chosen one, your profound spiritual alignment dictates a much higher frequency. You quickly recognized that protecting your hard-earned peace was infinitely more valuable than desperately trying to prove your point to a group of committed misunderstanders. You simply packed up your precious energy, turned your back, walked away, and went entirely no contact. You successfully starved them of the very battle they so desperately, psychotically craved. The deep psychology driving their intensely one-sided war is a tragic, highly volatile mix of absolute entitlement and a terrifying loss of control. They actually feel deeply entitled to your energy. They genuinely believe that if they poke you, you inherently owe them a massive reaction. When you firmly withhold that reaction, their fragile ego goes into a state of hyperdrive. They literally cannot process the fact that you simply do not care enough about them to fight them. To compensate for this profound rejection, they continue to attack the air, throwing wild punches in the dark, weaving incredibly elaborate fictional narratives to absolutely anyone who will listen, and constantly, obsessively, checking your silent spaces for any tiny sign that they finally got under your skin. This behavior requires a gargantuan, highly unsustainable amount of emotional labor. They are expending massive amounts of spiritual energy on a daily basis just to keep their hatred for you alive, while you haven't thought about them in months. Metaphorically, they are permanently stuck in a boxing ring, sweating profusely, grunting loudly, and throwing vicious rapid-fire combinations at the empty air, shadowboxing furiously in a funhouse hall of mirrors until their knuckles literally bleed. Meanwhile, you are miles away, sitting quietly on a beautiful porch, calmly drinking tea and reading a good book. They look utterly deranged and completely unhinged to anyone objectively observing them. It is a goofy, pathetic, and deeply exhausting spectacle. Life is beating them down through the highly efficient vehicle of their own sick obsession. The sheer, overwhelming fatigue of holding a massive grudge against someone who is peacefully, consistently elevating, is physically aging them, rapidly draining their vitality and deeply clouding their judgment in every other single area of their life. They are literally burning their own house completely to the ground just to keep themselves warm, highly hoping the smoke will somehow bother your eyes, utterly oblivious to the fact that you have already relocated to an entirely different emotional hemisphere. Number 7, their relentless, malicious attempts to sabotage and bury you ended up becoming the exact undeniable catalyst for your greatest elevation. This is the absolute ultimate, deeply bitter pill they are currently being forced to swallow dry. In their profound, blinding arrogance, they genuinely believed they held the ultimate power to permanently destroy your path. They meticulously set hidden traps. They aggressively assassinated your character behind your back. They actively closed heavy doors in your face, and they attempted to completely separate you from your necessary resources. They thought they were burying you deep in the dirt, but they fundamentally, catastrophically misunderstood the divine spiritual material you are made of. You are a chosen one. You do not rot when placed in the dark. You germinate. You took every single heavy obstacle they maliciously threw at you and engaged in the absolute highest form of spiritual alchemy. You used their painful betrayal to fortify your ironclad boundaries. You used their cruel rejection to redirect your path toward your true, massive purpose. The deep, agonizing psychological torment they are experiencing right now stems directly from the absolute, crushing humiliation of realizing they accidentally helped you win. Their fragile ego is violently shattering into a million pieces because they desperately wanted to be the evil architect of your permanent ruin. And instead, they unwittingly served as the unpaid, highly efficient construction crew for your magnificent palace. They are terrified of their own undeniable impotence. They realize, with absolute horror, that they have entirely lost control of the grand narrative. They faithfully followed the predictable script of a villain, fully expecting you to cower and play the weak victim. But you flipped the script entirely and became the undeniable hero of your own epic story. Their behavior now is heavily marked by a stunned, bitter, highly toxic paralysis. They cannot move forward in their own lives because they are too busy staring up at the sky, completely bewildered at how you managed to fly out of the cage they built so carefully. Think of it as them enthusiastically spending years gathering highly heavy, jagged rocks, hauling them sweating up a massive mountain, and furiously hurling them down at you, deeply hoping to crush your spirit into dust. But instead of being crushed, you quietly, patiently collected every single rock they threw, stacked them meticulously, and used them to build an impenetrable, magnificent fortress. Now, they are standing at the absolute bottom of the mountain, physically exhausted, with entirely empty hands, looking up at the magnificent, towering castle you reside in. A castle they literally, actively provided the heavy materials for. The agony of this profound realization is entirely unparalleled in the human experience. Life is beating them severely by forcing them to watch you continuously thrive on the very ground they maliciously tried to salt. They see the resilience, but they cannot replicate the alchemy. They see the absolute peace, but they are completely drowning in the chaotic war they started against the universe itself. Number 8. They are permanently trapped in an agonizing, perpetual loop of comparison. While you have completely transcended the primitive need to compete, the insecure individuals who obsessively mimic and harbor deep animosity toward you view the entire world through a highly distorted, toxic lens of absolute scarcity. In their fragile, panicked mind, there is only a strictly limited amount of success, love, and light to go around. If you are shining brightly, they falsely deeply believe it automatically and permanently dims their own light. Therefore, they must constantly outshine you, out-earn you, outperform you, and outmaneuver you at every single turn. Their entire, miserable existence is a frantic, breathless, highly exhausting sprint to simply be perceived as better than you. But you, standing firmly in your authentic divine alignment, realize that your specific path is entirely singular. You are not running a race against them. You are running a massive race against your own infinite potential. You have tapped into the infinite abundance of the divine, where comparison goes to permanently die. The psychology of their endless obsessive comparison is deeply rooted in a profound, unshakable sense of intrinsic worthlessness. Because they literally do not know who they are in a vacuum. They can only define their own value by how they favorably measure up against someone else. And because you are the highly polished mirror they cannot stop aggressively staring into, you have become their permanent, inescapable measuring stick. This is pure, unadulterated psychological torture for them. Every single time you level up, every time you find genuine peace, every time you smile a truly authentic smile, it feels exactly like a physical, heavy blow to their fragile ego. They cannot genuinely celebrate anything they achieve because their own achievements are instantly nullified in their minds if you seem even slightly happier. They are entirely terrified of being left behind. Yet their obsessive focus on your journey ensures they never actually progress on their own. It is highly akin to them aggressively running on a treadmill, set at absolute maximum speed, sweating profusely, their heart rate dangerously high, entirely, obsessively focused on staring at you out the window. Meanwhile, you are outside, walking at a highly steady, deeply peaceful pace through a beautiful, serene forest, actually moving forward in the real world. They are completely exhausting themselves, burning themselves out, while staying in exactly the same stagnant place. It is a frantic, deeply tragic waste of a human life. Life is beating them down heavily because the universe simply does not reward those who stubbornly refuse to walk their own unique path. They are being rapidly consumed by the highly corrosive acid of their own hyper-competitive spirit, while you remain entirely unbothered, refusing to even look over your shoulder to see if they are still frantically running. They see the calm, but entirely miss the profound internal security that makes competition irrelevant. Number 9. The universe has methodically and intentionally stripped them of their toxic accomplices, leaving them to face the terrifying void entirely alone. When they were at the absolute arrogant peak of their malicious campaign against you, they rarely ever acted alone. Deep cowards always travel in large, noisy packs. They aggressively gathered flying monkeys, weak-minded enablers, and other deeply insecure, highly easily manipulated people to form a massive, toxic chorus of validation. They used this loud, chaotic echo chamber to constantly reinforce their grand delusions and fiercely convince themselves they were righteous in their attacks. During that highly specific time, you were likely forced by the universe into a season of profound, incredibly painful, yet highly sacred isolation. You walked through the dark valley entirely alone, accompanied only by the divine. You learned exactly how to survive the deafening silence. You learned how to become your own unshakable sanctuary, totally reliant on your internal alignment. But the deep psychology of the toxic, highly performative imitator heavily dictates that they absolutely cannot survive in isolation. Their incredibly fragile ego requires a massive amount of constant external scaffolding just to keep from collapsing inward. They are completely terrified of the silence, because the deep silence aggressively forces them to hear the undeniable truth of their own wretched, rotting, internal condition. However, toxic bonds are fundamentally highly fragile by nature. Relationships entirely built on mutual hatred, petty gossip, and deep insecurity violently shatter the exact moment real, sustained pressure is applied. Life is now beating them severely by systematically dismantling their entire artificial support system. The people they eagerly gossiped with are now eagerly gossiping about them. The individuals they heavily manipulated are finally waking up to the gross manipulation. The fake alliances they forged in the dark are rapidly dissolving in the harsh light of day. There is absolutely no loyalty among the spiritually bankrupt. Imagine a completely crumbling, highly dilapidated, rotting tower that they proudly and loudly called their grand kingdom. When the inevitable heavy storm of universal consequence finally hit, the rats were the absolute first to flee the sinking structure. The very people they relied heavily upon to hold up their false, performative reality have completely scattered to the wind. Now they are standing completely alone in the dusty ruins of their own malicious making. The sheer irony is deeply, profoundly poetic. They deliberately engineered your deep isolation, highly hoping it would completely break your spirit, but it only turned you into an entirely unbreakable warrior. Now the universe is forcefully plunging them to absolute isolation, and because they entirely lack your solid internal architecture, it is absolutely, violently destroying them. They are terrified, frantic, and flailing wildly, reaching out for hands that are completely no longer there, forced to finally look at themselves without the buffer of an audience. Number 10. They are agonizingly mourning the permanent loss of the highly accommodating version of you that they could freely disrespect and manipulate. There was a highly specific time before your spiritual awakening reached its current, soaring altitude, when you were highly accommodating, perhaps even a people pleaser. You operated from a place of pure, unfiltered empathy, constantly offering massive amounts of grace where it was absolutely not deserved, readily forgiving heavy offenses that should have been immediate deal breakers, and generously keeping the door open for people who continuously tracked toxic mud all over your peace. They absolutely loved that highly accessible version of you. They felt immensely artificially powerful, knowing they could constantly cross your boundaries, disrespect your energy, and still have full, unrestricted access to your warm light. But then, the Chosen One finally awoke. You instituted ironclad, heavy boundaries. You permanently sealed the vault. You removed their access entirely, without explanation, and absolutely without apology. The deep, agonizing psychology behind their current, massive meltdown is exactly akin to the frantic, sweating panic of a severe addict whose drug supply has been abruptly and permanently cut off. Let us be absolutely clear. They do not actually miss you as a complex human being. They severely miss the profound, highly beneficial experience of exploiting your spiritual capital. They miss the exact way your forgiving presence made them feel about their own highly flawed selves. They severely miss having a highly reliable, always open dumping ground for their heavy emotional garbage. When you removed yourself, you didn't just casually walk away. You violently triggered their deepest, most unhealed abandonment wounds and their terrifying loss of control. They are currently acting out because they actually feel a nostalgic, deeply toxic entitlement to your energy. They genuinely believe, in their arrogant delusion, that they own the absolute right to consume you. The realization that they have been permanently locked out is causing their fragile ego to splinter. Metaphorically, they are exactly like someone standing shivering in the freezing, pouring rain, angrily and frantically shoving a highly rusted, completely outdated key into a heavy door lock, loudly screaming and violently kicking the door because it absolutely won't open. They literally cannot comprehend that you simply, quietly, changed the locks and heavily reinforced the entire door with thick steel. It looks deeply pathetic and incredibly goofy from the outside. They are aggressively demanding free entry into a beautiful house they previously completely trashed, utterly shocked and highly offended to find that the owner is no longer taking their calls. Life is beating them down with the heavy, inescapable, crushing consequence of their own profound ingratitude. They arrogantly took your immense grace entirely for granted, falsely assuming it would flow freely forever. and now they are slowly dying of thirst in the desert of their own sheer entitlement. They are mourning a massive loss, but the tragedy is entirely self-inflicted. Number 11, the counterfeit, swaggering confidence they boldly display is loudly cracking under the immense, unavoidable pressure of actual adversity. When the bright sun is shining, when there is absolutely no real pressure, and when life is generally easy, it is incredibly easy for highly toxic, deeply performative people to project an aura of supreme, unshakable confidence. They boast loudly, they flex their material possessions, they speak with a loud, highly unearned authority, and they constantly attempt to aggressively intimidate those around them with their highly fabricated bravado. They looked at you, deep in your quiet, agonizing struggle, and they arrogantly mocked your painful process. But you, the true chosen one, possess a deep, undeniable grit that was heavily forged in the absolute darkest, coldest winters of the human soul. Your confidence is not a loud scream. It is an unbreakable, entirely silent knowing. You have been tested by fire, and you did not burn. You became the fire. The psychology of the imitator is deeply, fundamentally fragile, because their confidence is purely 100% aesthetic. It is entirely, completely untested by reality. They are absolutely terrified of real, heavy hardship because they know deep in their own bones that they absolutely do not possess the necessary internal tools to actually survive it. They rely heavily on the rigid script of superficial success, but they have never actually read the heavy manual on spiritual resilience. Now the seasons have violently changed. Life is currently delivering real, undeniable, highly heavy adversity directly to their front doorstep. The karma is officially arriving. The severe financial hit, the total relationship collapse, the highly embarrassing public exposure. Whatever the specific crisis is, it is entirely real. And under the massive weight of this reality, their counterfeit confidence is completely imploding. They do not know how to regulate themselves. They do not know how to suffer with an ounce of grace. They are heavily panicking. It is completely identical to a highly arrogant child proudly placing a folded paper boat onto a small, calm puddle on a bright, sunny day, and loudly, aggressively proclaiming themselves to be a master, unbeatable sea captain. It looks perfectly fine until the sky suddenly darkens, the heavy wind howls, and a genuine, massive hurricane rolls in. The flimsy paper boat doesn't just slowly sink. It instantly, violently disintegrates. Meanwhile, you are confidently standing at the heavy helm of a battle-tested, iron-hulled vessel, navigating the massive, crashing waves with a highly calm, incredibly steady hand. They are currently looking at you in absolute, wide-eyed terror, realizing that their loud, arrogant words absolutely cannot stop the incoming floodwater. Life is beating them severely because raw reality holds absolutely no respect for flimsy paper boats. Their massive arrogance is being violently shattered by the sheer blunt force of consequence, and absolutely everyone is watching the fake facade wash away into the storm drain of their own incompetence. Number 12. They are finally arriving at the terrifying, undeniable realization that your spiritual protection is not a myth, but a highly active, dangerous reality. For the absolute longest time, the people who maliciously plotted against you operated under a purely secular, highly materialistic, and deeply flawed delusion. They genuinely thought this was just a simple, petty game of flesh and blood. They falsely believed that if they were just clever enough, sneaky enough, and highly manipulative enough, They could completely dismantle your entire life without facing any real repercussions. They looked at your gentle kindness and fundamentally mistook it for a total lack of defense. But what they entirely, catastrophically failed to factor into their sinister, dark calculus is that a chosen one absolutely does not walk alone. You are heavily insulated by deep divine alignment. You are fiercely guarded by unseen forces that do not require your physical intervention to strike back effectively. The deep psychology of their current, massive meltdown is firmly rooted in the sheer, unadulterated, paralyzing panic of hitting a massive, invisible wall they cannot comprehend. When a highly toxic person deliberately directs malice toward a heavily spiritually protected individual, they fully expect to see the target quickly fall. When the target remains entirely unbothered, and instead the toxic person's own life begins to mysteriously, rapidly fall completely apart, it entirely shatters their entire fragile paradigm of control. They are completely terrified because they are suddenly realizing they are no longer fighting you. They are actively fighting the heavy spiritual laws of cause and effect. They are warring against the divine architecture that securely shields you. Their highly fragile ego literally cannot process the terrifying fact that they are fundamentally, entirely outmatched by something they cannot see, touch, or easily manipulate. They are losing their minds because the math is no longer working. To clearly illustrate this, imagine a deeply arrogant, highly aggressive person winding up with absolutely all their might to throw a devastating knockout punch at what they think is a completely defenseless ghost, only to violently, agonizingly break their hand completely against an impenetrable, solid steel beam hidden just inches behind the apparition. The physical and emotional pain is excruciating, entirely unexpected, and utterly paralyzing. You didn't even have to raise your fists or blink an eye. Their own highly aggressive momentum completely caused their own destruction. Life is systematically, severely dismantling them because they recklessly tampered with a massive spiritual voltage they were profoundly, entirely unqualified to ever handle. They are now actively experiencing the severe electric shock of divine retribution, and they are left crying, nursing their broken hands, highly terrified to ever reach in your specific direction again. They see the calm, but miss the resilience, completely misjudging the unbreakable spiritual armor you wear. Number 13. The dark, hidden envy that actively fueled their ambition has completely mutated into a corrosive poison that is actively devouring their peace. Envy is absolutely not simply a fleeting, harmless emotion. When left entirely unchecked, it is a highly concentrated spiritual acid. From the very beginning, their entire obsessive motivation for mimicking you, heavily competing with you, and attempting to violently destroy you was birthed from profound, rotting envy. They absolutely hated the undeniable fact that you possessed a beautiful light they could not buy with money, manufacture with lies, or steal with manipulation. Because they could not genuinely celebrate your deep essence, they made the highly fatal, deeply toxic decision to try and completely extinguish it. But the Chosen One's divine light absolutely cannot be snuffed out by the weak, putrid breath of an insecure hater. You simply continued to shine, growing exponentially brighter with every attempt they made to aggressively shade you. The deep, inescapable psychological torment they are enduring right now is the direct result of this massive envy having absolutely nowhere left to go, but entirely inward. When highly toxic energy is forcefully, entirely rejected by the intended target, it violently ricochets back and actively begins to rapidly digest the host. They are currently losing massive amounts of sleep. They are visibly, physically aging. Their physical health, their mental focus, and their overall daily vitality are rapidly, undeniably deteriorating. They literally cannot enjoy their own lives, their own families, or their own supposed successes because their fragile mind is entirely, obsessively colonized by the constant thought of you. They are terrified of their own dark obsession, yet they are completely, utterly powerless to stop it. They are held hostage by a rigid script of resentment that firmly dictates they must remain miserable as long as you are at genuine peace. This erratic behavior is metaphorically identical to a deeply disturbed, highly irrational individual actively setting the solid foundation of their own beautiful house completely on fire, just so they can use the massive plumes of smoke to intentionally blow soot into your perfectly clean windows. They are perfectly, psychotically, willing to burn their entire, miserable existence to the ground if they genuinely think it will momentarily inconvenience your peace. But the wind has violently shifted. The thick smoke is only severely choking them, and their burning house is actively collapsing completely around their ears. While your windows remain absolutely spotless and gleaming, life is beating them severely because they consciously chose the dark path of destruction over the difficult path of self-improvement. Their deep envy has literally become a massive cancer to their spirit, rotting their joy completely from the inside out, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the ashes of their consumed potential. Number 14. They are left holding the agonizing, inescapable realization that they were the sole, deliberate architects of their own spectacular destruction. This is the absolute final, ultimate, completely devastating stage of their unspooling. For many years, highly toxic and deeply performative individuals survive entirely by heavily outsourcing their blame. They always, without fail, have a designated scapegoat. If they fail miserably, it is someone else's fault. If they are explosively angry, someone else directly provoked them. They desperately, frantically tried to make you the ultimate, permanent scapegoat for their entirely miserable, chaotic, internal condition. But because you completely, cleanly removed yourself from the entire equation, and because you massively ascended far beyond their petty reach, they have entirely run out of people to blame. The room is completely empty. The silence is absolutely deafening, and the mirror is massive. The absolute, undeniably terrifying core of their current psychological collapse is the inescapable, heavy mirror of ultimate accountability. They are deeply terrified because the grand illusion has entirely, permanently evaporated. They look around at the smoking wreckage of their life, the massively lost opportunities, the completely broken relationships, the entirely ruined reputation, the profound, echoing lack of genuine joy. And they are violently forced to admit, in the dark, quiet, lonely hours of the night, that they did this entirely to themselves. They literally cannot point the trembling finger at you, because you haven't been in the room for years. They are suffering the absolute ultimate punishment. Total, uncompromising self-awareness, completely without the emotional capacity or the genuine humility required to actually change. They are frozen stiff in a state of rigid, highly performative stubbornness, watching their ship rapidly sink while stubbornly refusing to ask for a life preserver. Imagine them enthusiastically spending years meticulously building a massive, heavy, iron cage. They forged the thick bars with their constant gossip. They welded the heavy hinges with their dark manipulation. and they crafted the intricate lock with their relentless deceit. They stepped proudly inside the heavy cage, highly hoping to lure you in so they could violently trap you forever. But you simply, quietly walked right past them. Now they have accidentally slammed the heavy door shut, locked it completely from the inside, and accidentally swallowed the only key. They are permanently, hopelessly trapped in the freezing prison of their own malicious design. Life is beating them down heavily because the massive universe firmly demands balance. They are entirely, completely responsible for the exact hell they are currently living in, and that silent, highly undeniable truth is the heaviest burden a human soul can ever be forced to actually carry. They see your quiet, unbounded victory, and it amplifies the loud reality of their self-imposed collapse. When you zoom out and look at the grand, sweeping, massive architecture of this entire situation, one profound, completely undeniable truth becomes entirely impossible to ignore. The highly toxic people who aggressively targeted you, obsessively mimicked you, and desperately tried to completely bury you were never actually fighting your physical actions or your earthly accomplishments. They were entirely, completely at war with your raw energy, your pure divine alignment, and the absolute, unshakable purity of your resilience. They were violently fighting the blinding light that effortlessly exposed their carefully hidden shadows. They heavily relied on cheap external performance, highly curated masks, rigid scripts, and the entirely cheap applause of the crowd just to feel alive. You relied strictly on solid internal architecture, profound peace, and the unbreakable ancient bond between your spirit and the divine. The universe has conducted a massive audit of the situation, and it has violently, permanently rejected their counterfeit existence. Life is now aggressively beating them down one by one, not by striking them with massive lightning bolts from the sky, but by simply, quietly leaving them completely alone in a dark room with the heavy consequences of their own dark hearts. I want you to hear me incredibly clearly, chosen ones. You absolutely do not need to prove a single thing to anyone. You do not ever need to perform your healing for an audience. You do not need to desperately seek petty revenge, gloat over their misery, or dangerously lower your high vibration to celebrate their catastrophic downfall. Keep your hands absolutely, spotlessly clean. Let them completely exhaust themselves, fighting the massive ghosts of their own incredibly poor decisions. Let them slowly drown in the shallow, stagnant pools of their own external validation. Your only singular job is to remain entirely, profoundly unbothered, to keep rapidly growing, to keep meticulously building your beautiful internal sanctuary, and to remain fiercely, unapologetically, and entirely authentic. You survived the scorching fire, and now you get to peacefully enjoy the warm light while they violently choke on the thick smoke they deliberately created. If this message resonated with your spirit today, subscribe to the channel right now. Hit the like button to signal to the algorithm that the truth matters. Drop a comment with what point hit you hardest, and share this video with someone who desperately needs the reminder. Stay chosen. Stay blessed.